Hey everyone, welcome to our webinar. This is Mary Nicely with the California Department of Education, and I'm really excited to be here with Casey Lee, our state parks interpreter, and we are here to take a tour of the Angel Island Immigration Station in honor of API Heritage Month, which kicked off in May. And Casey will be leading us through tours. If you have questions, please put them in your chat on Facebook or Zoom, and we will get to those if we have time. But right now, I'm going to hand it over to Casey Lee. And thank you, Casey, for the great welcome and tour so far of the immigration station here at Angel Island. And we're really thankful for our California partners. So, Casey, I'm going to hand it off to you.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm here at Angel Island State Park in the middle of San Francisco Bay. So if you're standing in San Francisco looking towards Alcatraz, Angel Island's right behind it. So we're not quite as famous as our little neighbor Alcatraz. It takes about 33 Alcatrazes to make one Angel Island. We're the largest island in San Francisco Bay. And we have a long and complicated history here at this park. The first people to live here are the Coast Miwok, today known as the Federated Indians of the Grayton Rancheria. And that modern tribe is made up of both Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people. Their story goes back to time immemorial, thousands of years of living in this area and on Angel Island. The modern history starts with Spanish that came to make the first map of San Francisco Bay in 1775 and gave Angel Island the Spanish version of its current name. This island has been a site of the Army for the United States since 1863, all the way till 1962, from the Civil War to the Cold War. We also had a historic quarantine station here on Angel Island from the 1890s to the 1940s, and making sure ships that arrived with people that were ill aboard were quarantined away from San Francisco to prevent the spread of those illnesses. But today we're focusing on our immigration story. The U.S. Immigration Station Angel Island only operated for 30 years, from 1910 to 1940. But the story here goes further back in time because of the Chinese exclusion laws that were passed in 1882, affecting a lot of the people that were held here. Chinese immigration in the United States really gets going during the gold rush. Only about 50 Chinese people were in the U.S. prior to 1849. A few years later, we have about 20,000 Chinese people, mostly here in the West. And the laws started being passed that discriminated against Chinese laborers here in the United States. They were restricted from attending public school, from owning property. They had to pay a foreign miner's tax, and they couldn't testify in court against a white person. And so all of those things led to dangerous situations for Chinese people, especially here in California, but throughout the United States. People were physically harmed, things were taken from them, and there wasn't a lot of legal recourse they had. During the gold rush is that first wave, and then we have another wave of immigration during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1870s. That gets finished. And we have a downturn in the economy caused by the end of the Civil War. So when times are tough, it is very common in American history and throughout countries in the world to look for someone to blame for those economic problems. And often the people scapegoated are newer groups of immigrants. And that's what happened to the Chinese in the 1870s. There were labor unions organizing. They were telling their membership, which were the voting population of the time, white men, that they needed to kick out the Chinese from America to improve their working situation. Slogans like "the Chinese must go" were commonly used. So by 1882, this becomes a nationwide issue, in part because of the involvement of unions, even though most of the Chinese population was in the West. And so 1882, the first of a series of Chinese exclusion acts are passed. It limits Chinese laborers and stops them from coming to the United States for 10 years. At the end of that, it's extended and extended and eventually becomes indefinite, lasting all the way until 1943. So we have this long history of exclusion. There were other groups that were also excluded that were held here on Angel Island as well, and we'll talk about that too. But I'm inside of the detention barracks And this was the space where people were held. The immigrants in this room were all from China because of the racial segregation that took place here. There were 3 categories people were separated into based on race: European, Asian, and Chinese. Now, China, of course, is in Asia, and most of the Europeans weren't from Europe. They were from Russia, which was also in Asia. And so everyone's coming across the Pacific to the West Coast. But the racial segregation that took place here also indicated the type of treatment you would receive. So in the Chinese men's room, this room at its full size, it's been divided during World War II, but its full size, it was considered healthy for 50 people, but there were 200 beds. And that's according to health standards of that time, not modern standards. So the way you cram that many beds in a space is bunk beds. And there's no ladder or anything to get up to the upper bunks. So if you want to go up, you simply step on the beds of the people below you. You can actually see a wear pattern in the floor from people walking up and down in between the beds because everything was covered by beds. There weren't many places to walk. There were some open spaces at the end of the room where there might be a table and some recreational spaces inside and outside. But for the most of your day, you're going to be in this space. If a bed's not being used, it can be folded up and locked in an upright position to create more space. And because people arrive here by boat, we are a true island, the numbers of people detained fluctuate greatly. So when a boat arrives, you get a lot of people. Some are allowed to leave after 2 or 3 days. The number comes down, kind of levels out. As people slowly leave, another boat arrives. So you have these kind of spikes of occupation inside of the space. People that were held here were trying to come into the United States under exceptions to the Chinese exclusion law. So you could come in as a student, a tourist, a teacher, a diplomat, a merchant, or the child of an American citizen. And everyone that would have stayed in these bunks was trying to find a way to be in one of those categories, whether they were in one or not. And so some people got paper names. They got an identity that allowed them to come, typically the child of an American citizen. Now, Chinese immigrants were not allowed to naturalize. If you were Asian, you could not become a US citizen. And so those folks had limited opportunities. There were very few women from China in the United States at this time. And so if you wanted to get married and have children, it was very difficult. There were laws saying you couldn't marry someone that didn't look like you. And so you had to find one of those very few Chinese women here if you were going to get married. Or more commonly, marry someone back in China and visit them from time to time. And in 1906, when the earthquake hit San Francisco, it damages the city, but it also destroys City Hall, where all the birth records are kept. Suddenly, nobody knows who is or is not born in the city of San Francisco. This becomes an opportunity for immigration because the city wanted to have records. They asked people to come, tell us if you were born here, and everyone came. And they said, I was born here, and I have this many sons. And people would exaggerate the number of children they had, particularly sons, because that was the most desirable sex to come in this process. And so they would add those names, and those names sold to come here. We call them paper son woman. So far more boys than girls. And this did exist before the earthquake, but on a much smaller scale. So the immigration officials wanted to exclude Chinese, but they also had an obligation to let people in that were allowed to come in. And so they developed questions to get down and try and figure out who is telling the truth and who is not. So how many of you out there know the birth dates and death dates of your grandparents and your great-grandparents? How many chickens does your neighbor have? How many stairs to your front door? Where's the rice bin located in your house? What's the shape of the back of the chairs where you eat your meals? Does a picture hang on the wall? What is it? These are typical questions that people were asked during the entry hearing process in a board of special inquiry. The immigrants called it an interrogation. And you waited in this building to be taken down to the administration building to answer those questions. And if you can see behind me, let's see if we can open this window. It's actually caging on these windows. And the immigrants referred to this place as a jail, they referred to themselves as prisoners. And that is because they were very restricted in what you could do here. Around this building is a fence with barbed wire. Around that fence and around the site of the immigration station, which included a hospital, an administration building, a powerhouse, there's another fence to separate it from the rest of the island, which was the US Army. And beyond that fence, it's an island. And so escape was not a real viable possibility, although there were a few escapes. But you could see how people very easily refer to themselves and think of this place as a prison. So to pass the time here, some people expressed themselves through writing on the walls of this building. And that's the reason this building has become so important and so protected. This building, the plan from California State Parks, when the island becomes a park, the whole island becomes a park in the 1960s, the idea is to get people outside.
State Superintendent.
Oh, welcome. Thanks for joining.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to give my greetings from the state capitol to everyone at Angel Island as we recognize the contributions of the Asian American Pacific Islander community, and we celebrate AAPI Awareness Month. I can't think of a better way to highlight the experience and the contributions of many in the AAPI community by going to Angel Island and uplifting one of our great state parks at the same time. Many in our communities have come through Angel Island as immigrants and helped to make California the great state that it is, whether it's through local business or cultural contributions. We have so much to be thankful for our partners in the AAPI community. And as the son and grandson of immigrants, I'm grateful that part of how we are celebrating the contributions of the AAPI community is through recognition of the immigrant experience at Angel Island. And so I wish I could be there with you in person. I'm about to give testimony on legislation, but I just wanted to provide greetings and to say that the California Department of Education will continue to support all people, including our friends and partners in the AAPI community. I'm grateful to our leaders like Mary Nicely, who's probably the highest ranking person of AAPI descent in any state office and has served well these last dozen years to state of California, and to all of our partners who've worked with us to create an ethnic studies graduation requirement where our students will learn about the contributions of their answers in the AAPI community, as well as African Americans, Latino, and Native Americans. There's so much more that we can do, but we stand together in solidarity with our AAPI community. We wish you a happy Awareness Month. And to those of you on the tour, enjoy your time at Angel Island, promoting history, our state parks. And I hope that everyone who's seeing this Zoom will come and visit at Angel Island and support our state parks in the great state of California. Thanks for letting me say hello, and have a wonderful day. And once again, to those celebrating AAPI Heritage Month, congratulations and thank you for all your contributions to the state of California.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Thank you so much. That's so wonderful. So I really appreciate the director talking about API Heritage Month. We get a lot of interest in our park during the month of May, but I also want to remind folks that every month is API Heritage Month on Angel Island. We talk about these stories all year, and we are here for you. We'll talk at the end about how you can connect directly here to us at the park through programs like Ports. But I want to get back on track so we can continue this story. But I was talking about the different questions people were asked and the ways that they pushed back on this treatment, right? So one of the ways people resisted here was through protest. They protested the food that was being served in the dining hall. When the facility first opened, everyone was given the same style of meal, more European style food, stews, kind of everything mixed together. And the Chinese immigrants wanted food that was more familiar. And so they protested, they wrote letters, they had what we might call a sit-in, what the immigration service called a riot, where they refused to leave the dining hall or refused to go to the dining hall, and used these kind of collective action, if you will, to get improvements to this facility. When this place opened in the newspapers, it was touted as the finest immigrant station that had ever been. And within 2 years, they were doing major renovations here because there were a lot of issues just in the public health realm of this facility. We also got the nickname very quickly in 1910 of the Ellis Island of the West. Now, Ellis Island, a lot more familiar story, generally taught in schools, with the Statue of Liberty standing next door, welcoming immigrants. But Angel Island does not have a Statue of Liberty. This was not a place of welcome. Immigrants that had an easy time immigrating never set foot on Angel Island. They'd be processed on the ship in the bay and allowed to go directly to San Francisco. Folks that were sent here were put onto a ferry and brought here, either to the immigration station or perhaps to the quarantine station if there was no immigration issue. And so for folks coming to Angel Island, it means you've already had a difficult time. You are being put into detention. But this is the legal process of immigration for this time period. And so many of the people that were detained here were allowed to leave. Average stays on Ellis Island were a few hours, 5-6 hours. Average stay on Angel Island is 2 to 3 days. For Chinese immigrants, that average goes up to 3 weeks because most Chinese immigrants were here either 2 to 3 days or 3.5 months. Not a lot of people experience that actual average of 3 weeks. They're kind of doing days or months here. The longest stay is about 2 years. And people, as I said, were coming from all over the world. Other ways that people pushed back on the treatment here was to write on the walls. And we see writing in about a dozen languages. But the most striking writing, the writing that saved this building from being destroyed, because as I was saying, California State Park, the plan here was to get people like camping and picnic areas. We're going to tear down these buildings. But immigrants that were detained here, especially China, wrote poems on the walls. So I'm going to take you to a spot over here where we can see a little bit of that writing a little better on camera. It's actually covering the walls, but it's hard to see. Even when you're here in person, we sometimes have to point it out to people. But this is a spot where some of the layers of paint that were added to try and cover up the so-called graffiti were removed. And so we can see, kind of going back in time, the top layer, yellow and gray, is actually from World War II, when prisoners of war, as well as Japanese Hawaiians, were held here. Going back in time to the immigration era, all the way to 1910, when the walls were bare wood. And the writing on the walls was mainly carved, is what we can see today. And so it's carved into the walls, but it was puttied over to try and cover it up. So these squares here, these 8 characters, are actually just part of a larger poem. The poem starts right up here, and most of the poems in the in 4 lines, but there are some variations on that because there's different styles of Chinese poetry. But a lot of them follow this format. So we can find them even if we can't see them completely. So this one says, the English translation, 1,000 sorrows and a hatred 10,000-fold burns between my brows. Hoping to step ashore the American continent is the most difficult of difficulties. The barbarians imprison me in this place. Even a martyr or a hero would change countenance. You can hear the strong emotions that are in these poems, and that is very typical of what we see. There are about 200 poems written on the walls of this building by the people that were held here for over the 30 years. So we have, someone with 1,000 sorrows, but their hatred is 10,000-fold. So as sad as the people are, they're also angry at what they're experiencing. Does anyone have any questions about the writing or the poems?
Yeah, I have a question about, so was there any idea when they were leaving they're leaving China, that this was going to be what would happen to them. I've seen pictures in the museum that show people in their suits and their hats and all dressed up really to come to this new world. And then all of a sudden this happens. Was there any, forewarning of what might happen, that they would turn them back?
Yeah, there were pretty good systems of communication within the Chinese community about what was going to happen when you were here, because you were so limited in your ability to come here and you had to fit into these exempt categories. People had to find their way into those categories. So usually a boy, when he was about 12 years old, was considered old enough to come to America to join his father. If you were coming as a paper son, you would actually get coaching papers that you would have to memorize to prepare you for what laid ahead. And so you would study maps of the village that you were from or supposed to be from. We do know that people who were true sons studied papers as well because they didn't want to mess up. But a lot of people would get papers from relationships that were just slightly altered. So instead of coming as your father's son, you would come as your uncle's son. So you're pretending to be the son of your uncle. And so you might know his name and what his house looks like, but you would have to memorize a lot more of those minute details to pass the entry hearing. So yes, there was a pretty good understanding of what was happening here on Angel Island. Often people would buy their first Western suit right before they traveled to the United States, trying to show that they were going to be part of the US and indicate that if you had the money to do so. And then we also see communication between the immigration station detention facility and the mainland surreptitiously. So the cooks that worked in the kitchen here were Chinese. And so on their days off, they could go to San Francisco, and they became a conduit to pass information between the island and the mainland. The Chinese men organized. They had the Angel Island Liberty Association. People usually paid dues into that, and the person who had been here the longest was in charge of the organization, a title you did not want. And so they would communicate. So if you were having a hard time maybe answering one of those questions, I don't remember who lives in the third row in the fourth house in my village, which is a question people were asked sometimes. You could get word to one of the association members. They would pass a note to the cooks during a meal. They would go to San Francisco. And so in your interrogation, you have to say, I don't remember, because later you can remember. And then that note would come back and be passed at mealtime back to those organization members and taken to the person it belonged to in the barracks. So when the cooks are passing that information, normally when they would set down dishes, they would just put them on the plate and put the food down and walk away. But if there was a note underneath, sometimes they would say, enjoy the chicken. Or they would say something about the dish to indicate, look under the plate. And then they would hide that and bring it back to the barracks. So people here are expressing themselves. Oh, I'm sorry. Were there any other questions? Not yet. Okay. So people were expressing themselves in the poetry here, but the poems actually tell a lot of the story, because for a long time, the people who were held here didn't talk about their experience. So the only way we were able to learn about this time was really through the poetry. So there's poems that talk about the bad food in the dining hall. There's poems that talk about the long detention, the long journey on the ocean, missing their family and being disconnected from home, and wanting news of what was happening back home. There's poetry about the entry hearings and being asked many questions. There's poetry about the political situation, the relationship between the US and China, and being frustrated with having a weak country in their perspective, in their homeland, because they weren't able to make the same negotiations with the US government that countries like Japan were able to do, and leverage that to have better treatment for their citizens when they came to the US. There's poetry about the poetry. There's a poem downstairs, we're up on the second floor right now, that says there are tens of thousands of poems on these walls. They are all cries of complaint and sadness. Now, there actually aren't tens of thousands of poems, but poetry isn't necessarily full of facts. It's full of feelings. It's meant to create an image in your mind. And if you imagine a place with tens of thousands of poems, you're going to imagine a place where the walls are covered in writing. And that is what you see when you're here. And so sometimes there's clues in the poems to the history of the site. Sometimes they're pretty clear, but we didn't completely understand them until further study was done. One of the poems in the building actually mentions that the walls are built of jade. And it says, even if it is built of jade, it has turned into a cage. And so you can see that as kind of a gilded cage, right? It doesn't matter how nice your prison is, if it's made of gold or diamonds or rubies or jade, you're still in prison. What we didn't necessarily understand at first is that it was also a reference to the color of the walls. And so when this work was done and the historian or the restoration folks were able to kind of peel back these layers of paint bit by bit, we actually saw that the walls were green for a lot of years of operation. Now, there were other clues in other poems. There's a poem on the opposite wall that says, the walls are as green as the grass that surrounds. That was a hint we probably should have gotten. But when this was revealed, we suddenly understood things a little bit better. And more people are coming forward to talk about their personal experiences here. And now we're seeing this first generation born here in the US also talking more about this family experience. Yes.
So, were there women and children? Were there families that came over? Were they in these same barracks, or where were they?
So children, depending on their age, might be in the men's side or might be with the women. So women and children were housed separately, initially in this building, but pretty quickly moved to the second floor of the administration building. So boys around the age of 12, being old enough to come to America, were also considered old enough to stay with the men. So if you were under 12, in theory, you would be with the women. But in reality, most people were not coming here with their moms because there were so few women coming. So most are traveling. Sometimes your dad would come to China to pick you up and you would travel together. But because your father is re-entering and is not new to coming to the United States, he would typically get to go straight to San Francisco and you would be sent here by yourself as a child. So I've also spoken to people as young as 9 years old that were held in the men's side simply because they were tall for their age. The writing on the walls and those oral histories have really come together to help us understand the experience of the people that were here. When I first started working here, I've worked on Angel Island for 25 years, forever. But one of the first people that I got to work with was a volunteer docent working at the immigration station. And his name was Dale Ching. And Dale had actually been detained here on Angel Island when he immigrated from China when he was 16 years old. And he was here for over 3 months when he was detained. Now, Dale was a true son. His father was an American citizen. He was allowed to immigrate under the law at the time, but he still had this experience of detention and having to appeal deportation, because that's when people that were here for 3 months are in the uncle who his answers were being compared to disagreed on one small fact. And it was the ladder that led to the sleeping loft back home in China. Dale said the ladder was nailed down. It didn't move. His uncle said, you can move the ladder. And that is because Dale's uncle had come to America before him and circumstances back home had changed. They had attached the ladder in the meantime. And that discrepancy led to a longer detention for Dale. He was here by himself as a 16-year-old. We see a lot of young people that are held here. And in part because it was expensive if you were coming as a paper son, and it was based on how old you are, people tend to skew younger when they are coming as paper sons and daughters. So teens, 20s maybe, because it costs about $100 for each year of life. So if you're 10 years old, that's $1,000. And that's back then money, not current money. So in modern, that's going to be somewhere in the $30,000 range. A large amount of money that a lot of people can't afford by themselves. I want to take you into the other half of this room and show you some of the photos Mary was talking about. We have some images here that were taken when the immigration station was in operation. And this photo is of the medical exams. This was another barrier to entry. The immigration officials worked with the Marine Hospital Service, which was the public health at that time. And they would have a very cursory medical exam that happened for all immigrants. And Asian immigrants typically had to have a more in-depth medical exam, which usually meant removing all of their clothing, which is not represented in this photo. We have to remember, when you look at historic photos, often they're a little bit staged. And part of that is just the technology. Everyone had to stand still. You couldn't take a true candid shot because if someone moved, it would ruin or blur the photograph. There's actually a little detail in the corner here where you can see a blur from someone moving a little bit when the photo was taken. Which the other reason we can get an indication that this is at least a slightly staged photo is you might notice how people are standing. People don't normally just casually stand in a semicircle facing a camera, right? So someone has told them to stand in this order. And the other thing we typically don't casually do is arrange ourselves by height. Right? So the shorter people are on the edges, the taller people are in the center. So we know there's been some sort of organization to get this photo done. Yeah, what's your question?
My question is, were there Chinese working here that could direct them if they did not speak English?
Yeah, there were translators in many languages here. There were the most Chinese translators. And part of that is communication, right? When we go to the doctor, we usually have a conversation, but here there wasn't a lot of conversation. It was more direction. So the doctor wouldn't say, okay, I'm gonna have you take your clothes off. We're gonna examine your skin. We're gonna look for these signs and these illnesses. The directions would be translated like, stand over there, take your clothes off, do this, do that, right? It's a more directive rather than a conversation. And then the translators for Chinese immigrants, because of the entry hearings, they used a lot of translators because the Immigration Service didn't believe that the translators could be objective when it came, because of their racism, when it came to their professionalism. And so the immigration officials would actually trade out translators much more frequently, and to the point of they didn't actually do that for other languages at all. They used the same translator for usually all the witnesses, including the folks that are here in the United States that are giving their testimony. But for Chinese cases, there would be different translators for each witness. Sometimes the translator would be switched out while talking to a witness, so they wouldn't potentially switch answers or become empathetic to the people that they're translating for. And they did prefer, it wasn't a total requirement, they did prefer that the Chinese translators be Christian. We kind of joke, like, because of course a Christian wouldn't lie, right? Obviously anyone is capable of lying. But they also wanted them to be Chinese American. So they wanted them to be American citizens by the translators. There's a case for the Korean translator who was actually kicked out of here for corruption and bribing people, who was later invited back. So he had actually violated the rules of the place, but was invited back, versus a Chinese translator had all of these requirements and restrictions and their capabilities. Any other questions out there? All right. Feel free to put those questions in the chat. I'm happy to go on a tangent. All right. So the medical inspections, here we're looking for trachoma. You can see the inspector is actually flipping up the eyelids of the people here. Trachoma is a condition that can cause blindness. And so people with trachoma, it was difficult to treat at the time, but it was sometimes treatable. It actually forces your eyelid to curl, and then your eyelashes scratch your cornea, your eyeball. And then that causes you to lose your sight. So if they could correct that curling and get your eyelid to lay flat again, sometimes your eye was able to heal and your vision would get better. But if you lost your vision or you couldn't correct that, you would be considered LPC. So abbreviations are not a new thing. LPC stands for likely to become a public charge. And that was a designation that was often used to exclude people who were poor, but it could be used to exclude people with medical conditions, mental health conditions, developmental disabilities, all of these different things that US was saying were not welcome in the US. So we actually see an oral history from a Russian woman talking about these medical inspections where the doctor was going down the line, looking at people's eyes and looking at their feet. You can sometimes see signs of hookworm on people's feet, which is a parasitic infection. And she watched the doctor go up and down, eyes, feet, eyes, feet, eyes, feet. And she said, he's not washing his hands in between us. And when the doctor got to her and went to go to touch her face, she slapped his hand away and basically said, don't touch my face with your dirty hands. And so even some of the patients understood some of those basic medical interactions that we understand very well today. But you have to remember, this is the early 1900s to 1940. This was the very beginning of kind of scientific medicine. And so there wasn't necessarily that understanding of how illnesses were spread. And so the doctors, of course, were not wearing gloves at that time. It was actually after the 1980s when doctors started wearing gloves more regularly. And we also see some kind of misunderstandings of things in the hospital. At the ceiling, where the walls met the ceiling, they actually had a curve rather than a corner. And they thought that curve would actually help things not get stuck in the corner like germs. And so I don't know how accurate that is. We kind of have come to the conclusion that's probably not super helpful, but all of the walls in the hospital have that curvature. But they did have very tall ceilings and windows that were across from each other to let in lots of light and lots of air circulation, which are things that are helpful to keeping people healthy. And so they were starting to get on the right track. They're using microscopes. They're taking samples, blood and stool, to look for parasitic infections. But those in-depth medical exams were definitely pushed more on Asian immigrants than European immigrants. Oh, I see a question.
If families were separated during the process, did they have a way of knowing what had happened to their family members?
So if families were separated, they were definitely separated by gender. So if men and women would be separated, you couldn't talk to that person directly because the Immigration Service didn't want you changing your answers and making sure that you weren't kind of cheating on the test. But people would sometimes call out to the people when they were going to meals because they had meals separately. And so there's oral histories of people opening the windows like I did on the side that faced the building where the women stayed and calling out to just kind of say like, hi, like, are you there? But you really didn't get to communicate directly with people until the decision to deport had been finalized. So if you were going to be deported, before you departed, you could have visitors. Yeah, it must have been really hard for people to be so close but not be able to communicate. Some communication could potentially happen through your lawyer, but that was kind of all official communication that's happening. And Chinese immigrants, they failed that entry hearing 50% of the time. But their deportation rate is less than 10% because they typically would hire a lawyer. And that was one of the kind of hard-earned pieces of knowledge in the Chinese community, is that you had the right to appeal and that you should hire a lawyer. And those came from the experiences all the way back to the gold rush of that discrimination and laws that restricted their way in the world. And so because they hired lawyers, they were often successful and weren't deported. So 2 to 3% is the typical deportation rate at Ellis Island and for European and Japanese immigrants here on Angel Island. And so they're higher deportation rates for sure, but not as high as people coming from India. As I mentioned, people came from all over the world. 80 different countries are represented as birthplaces for people detained here on Angel Island. And the largest deportation, or the highest deportation rate, is for people coming from India. South Asian immigrants failed the entry hearing 50% of the time, just like Chinese immigrants, but typically did not hire a lawyer and did not appeal. And that meant that almost all of them were deported. What's your question?
So you mentioned the 80 countries. We're also celebrating Jewish Heritage Month. And my understanding is that there's in the city, there is a Chinese Torah in one of the Jewish History Museum. So can you talk a little bit about the folks that came in, the Jewish community, the Jewish immigrants that came in to England?
Yeah, there were people that came mostly from Russia that were Jewish. And the Jewish people that were here today, we would have called them refugees. They were typically people fleeing for their own safety. So in the 19-teens, there's a period called the pogroms, which is the driving out of Jewish peoples from their communities. And so they would often have to leave with very little, or the resources they took with them, they had to use to get out of Russia. And so the folks, when they end up here, they have very little, which means they might be labeled LPC, likely to become a public charge because they're poor. But because they were considered white, they are have more opportunities in the labor market in the eyes of the Immigration Service. It was actually a point that was used to discriminate against Indian immigrants. It was kind of racism, informing racism, where it was hard for Indian people to find work. The immigration official said, well, you're going to have a hard time finding a job, so that means you'll become LPC. So I'm going to exclude you before you're discriminated against because you might be discriminated against. For the Jewish immigrants coming through, we have another wave of people coming in the early years of World War II. And so we see writing on the walls in other languages. So there's some Cyrillic writing that might be Russian, might be Ukrainian, because the people were actually from Kyiv in Ukraine. But during that time, it was the country of Russia. And they wrote Brothers Feingold. So they wrote their name and the date, December 25th, 1915. And that is what we see typically in the non-Chinese writing. Name, date, sometimes hometown, kind of typical graffiti. Now, the graffiti in the building, historically, it actually was graffiti. You weren't allowed to write on the walls. But today, of course, we value it a little higher. The writing on these walls saved this building. When the plans to tear it down came, the writing on the walls was kind of rediscovered and understood to be important by the community. And that's another thing that's really important to the story here, is that when the plan for tearing down this building was spread or shared more broadly, community members stepped up and they said, we want to save this. This is part of our story. A lot of those people had parents that were detained here, and they didn't know that until they went home and talked to their parents about visiting Angel Island. And so for a lot of them, it was the first time their parents were willing to say, I was detained there. And so these college-age students primarily put forward this community movement and got the state of California to change its mind. And now the site is also a National Historic Landmark because of its significance to U.S. history. It's our most valued site at Angel Island State Park. And millions of dollars have gone into trying to preserve and keep safe this space and other buildings on the site. So we're coming to the end of our time. I want to make sure there's no other questions out there.
There was one question about how did they find money for the lawyers?
How did they find money for the
they're
lawyers?
expensive, yeah.
Yeah, everything's expensive when it comes to immigration, and that hasn't changed, right? So having money is a big advantage in this immigration process. So if you are coming, it usually means you have some resources or you have taken this on as debt. And so we will pay back these debts once you get into the United States and get that kind of higher paying job than you might have had back home. There also people would sell their kind of paper sun slots to people to make money later. So it's kind of this cycle of debt and selling and debt and selling that gave people some opportunities to hire the help they needed to get through here. All right. Any other questions, guys? All right, so to kind of officially end the tour, I like to remind folks, immigration is not something from the distant past. Immigration is something that's happening now. If you yourself are not an immigrant, someone in your community, someone in your family, someone in your neighborhood is. And that's why learning about immigration and the story in our past is very important because it informs what's happening today, right? We see the discrimination against the Asian community that came with the COVID-19 pandemic. We see discrimination against immigrants today. And so it's up to you to decide how you want the future of immigration to look. Do you want it to look like the past? Do you want it to look like the present? Or do you have a different vision for the future? So we really encourage people to learn more about where our stories, how our story has gotten to this point and what the future might look like. So I also want to invite Mary back in and talk a little bit about ports.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope this was informative. As the state superintendent said, come out to Angel Island. There's really nothing like experiencing this in person. We also know that the state parks ports program is fantastic and being used by our educators all over the state of California. They sell out, or not sell out, book out, because I think it's all free, every single year. And so they'll be having signups again next year. I think we're booked up for the rest of the year for any of your.
There might be one or two spots, but we do have a webinar next week that's open to all. So you can submit questions to the Q&A and a live webinar with one of our staff leading API Heritage Month themed ports program. Ports, just in case you haven't heard, is Parks Online Resources for Teachers and Students. So it's our distance learning program in California State Parks. We have them at many parks throughout the state, not just Angel Island, but there's any topic you can think of, any topic you're wanting to get some support on, we'd love to be there for you. Most of our programs are live one-on-one with your classroom where kids can interact with the presenter. And then we also have those ports cast. So next Tuesday is our next ports cast. I think our last one maybe for the school year, and that'll be focused on immigration and API history. But there's topics, everything from railroads to redwood trees to elephant seals and geology. If there is a topic you're teaching, there's probably a ports program out there for you.
Yeah, so you can find it at the California State Parks website, and it's PORTS, right? So look for it there. You can also access these amazing resources through California Educators Together, which is the California Department of Education's teacher community of practice, where there are lesson plans, but these are our great partners at the state parks who have a link. We can jump over from there to here. And like Casey said, so many different topics that they cover. And so I think we are going to call it a wrap.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Highly recommend getting on the mailing list. We'll email you very minimally, I promise. No, sorry, not fingers crossed, actual promise. If a quick link to the sign up is through our partner, AIISF.org, but you can get there through the California State Parks website and look for ports. So parks.ca.gov, all our resources are in there. But you can also go directly to our port sites. But the mailing list, if you get on there, we will notify you when the programs are opening up. Some of our programs are under high demand. Angel Island's a pretty high demand location. So we'll send you that notice and say, hey, in a week, it's going to open up. And then we'll send you another one saying, it's open. And we do that a couple times a year. So we do some blocks, kind of fall and spring. And we'd love to have you all out at the parks in person. But we also realize that's not a practicality. You can't go to every park. We have 283 of them. You would never have a day in class. And so join us virtually if you can. And we'd love to see you out in your California state parks.
Great. Thank you, Casey.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you for the teams here at the state park that set this up for us, and for the folks back at CDE for setting this Zoom up, and thanks State Superintendent for popping in and giving some greetings. As we said, every day is API Heritage Month on Angel Island. And once again, we also are celebrating Jewish Heritage Month as well. So get out there this month and learn about some living history. Thank you all.